On Christmas night, 1776, a brutal nor'easter was tearing across the Delaware River. The water was choking with massive, jagged chunks of ice. Standing on the freezing riverbank was George Washington, and he was about to do something that every conventional military manual said was absolute suicide. He was going to load 2,400 starving, freezing, and poorly armed men into wooden flatboats, cross a treacherous river in the middle of a blizzard, and march 9 miles through the pitch dark. Their target? The town of Trenton, New Jersey. Waiting for them on the other side were over 1,000 Hessian mercenaries. These were professional German killers, the most feared, ruthless, and heavily armed shock troops on the North American continent. They were currently sleeping off their holiday celebrations in warm beds, completely unaware that a ragged mob of desperate rebels was coming for them. Washington knew that if this attack failed, his entire army would be wiped out, and the American Revolution would be dead by New Year's Day. But what the British and the Hessians did not know was that Washington was not walking into a slaughter. He was setting a trap. A trap so perfectly timed, so desperately executed, that in exactly 90 minutes, it would shatter the most elite fighting force in the world and change the course of human history forever. To understand why George Washington was willing to risk his own life and the lives of every man left in his army, you have to look at the brutal reality of December 1776. The American Revolution was, by every logical metric, already over. Just a few months earlier, the Continental Army had been humiliated. The British had chased them out of New York, inflicting catastrophic casualties. Washington had been forced to retreat across New Jersey, running from the British war machine for weeks. Now, his army was hiding in Pennsylvania, and it was falling apart. The numbers were terrifying. Washington had started the year with nearly 20,000 men. By Christmas, he had fewer than 3,000 soldiers fit for duty. And calling them soldiers was a stretch. These were farmers, mechanics, and young boys. They had no winter coats. Many had no shoes, wrapping their bleeding feet in dirty rags just to walk in the snow. They were surviving on scraps of flour and water. Typhus and dysentery were sweeping through the camps, killing men in their sleep. But the real nightmare was the calendar. The enlistment contracts for almost Washington's entire army were set to expire on December 31st. In exactly 1 week, his soldiers were legally allowed to drop their muskets and walk home. And given the freezing, starving conditions, almost every single one of them planned to do exactly that. The British commanders knew this. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, had already packed up and returned to the warmth of New York City for the winter social season. He ordered his officers to establish a chain of outposts across New Jersey and wait for the spring. Howe figured the rebel army would simply evaporate in the cold. There was no need to fight them. Nature and starvation were already doing the job for him. Washington was backed into a corner. He could not wait for spring, because by spring he would not have an army. He needed a victory. He needed something so shocking, so dramatic, that it would convince his men to re-enlist and convince the American public that this war was still winnable. He did not just need a battle, he needed a miracle. And he decided he was going to find it in Trenton. To understand what Washington was up against, you have to understand the Black Hessians. In 1776, the British Empire had a problem. They did not have enough soldiers to crush the American rebellion quickly. So, King George III opened his checkbook and rented 30,000 professional mercenaries from the German states. Most of them came from a region called Hesse Castle, which is why they were called Hessians. These men were not part-time militia. They were born and bred for war. From childhood, Hessian boys were drilled in military tactics, discipline, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. They were highly paid, highly trained shock troops. And they were terrifying. The Hessians wore massive brass-fronted caps to make themselves look 7 feet tall. They marched in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Their primary weapon was the musket, but their real reputation came from the bayonet. In battle after battle, the Hessians would fire a single, devastating volley, lower their steel blades, and charge. The Continental Army had seen this firsthand. American soldiers were so terrified of the Hessians that they would often drop their weapons and run before the Germans even got close. At Trenton, the Hessian garrison was commanded by Colonel Johann Röhl. Röhl was a battle-hardened veteran who had spent his entire life fighting in European wars. He had absolute contempt for the Americans. To him, Washington's men were not real soldiers. They were country bumpkins, farmers with pitchforks playing dress-up. And because he believed the Americans were pathetic cowards, Röhl made a fatal mistake. He got comfortable. He felt so safe in Trenton that he did not even bother to build defensive walls or dig trenches around the town. He thought the winter would freeze the rebels to death. He had no idea what was creeping toward him in the dark. While Colonel Röhl was drinking wine and playing cards in warm parlors, George Washington was fighting a quiet shadow war. Washington was obsessed with intelligence. Long before modern spy agencies existed, Washington built networks of local farmers, merchants, and smugglers to feed him information. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Washington sent a spy named John Honeyman into Trenton. Honeyman was a butcher and a weaver, but more importantly, he was a genius at playing the role of a British loyalist. He walked right into the Hessian camp, pretending to trade cattle for British gold. Honeyman chatted with the guards, noted the locations of their artillery, counted their troops, and mapped out the streets. Then, he intentionally got himself captured by American patrols and was brought straight to Washington's tent. Honeyman gave Washington exactly what he needed: the complete blueprint of Trenton. He reported that Röhl had roughly 1,400 men, but their guard was down. They were planning to celebrate Christmas heavily. Washington realized Trenton was a sitting duck. He began to design a trap. It was a classic pincer movement. He would cross the river, split his forces, and surround the town before the sun came up, cutting off every single escape route. The crazy part is, Colonel Röhl was actually warned. Local loyalists, Americans who supported the British, had noticed Washington's men gathering boats. They suspected an attack. On the evening of December 25th, as the Hessians were drinking, singing, and enjoying the holiday, a loyalist farmer knocked on Röhl's door. The guards would not let him in to interrupt the party. So, the man quickly scribbled a note warning Röhl that the American army was on the move. The note was handed to Röhl. He looked at it, did not bother to translate it, and shoved it directly into his coat pocket. He went back to his card game. That single unread piece of paper would end up costing him his life, and it would hand George Washington the greatest opportunity of the war. As the sun set on Christmas Day, the weather turned into a complete nightmare. A massive nor'easter slammed into the east coast. Freezing rain quickly turned into driving sleet and then into a blinding, horizontal blizzard. The temperature plummeted below freezing. Washington had originally planned a highly coordinated, multi-pronged operation. 3 separate American columns were supposed to cross the Delaware River at 3 different locations to surround Trenton completely. But the storm was so violent that 2 of those columns took one look at the raging water and gave up. They sent word that it was impossible. The ice was too thick, the current was too fast, and the wind was too deadly. That left Washington with just his single column of 2,400 men. If he crossed now, he would be doing it alone, without any backup. If things went wrong on the New Jersey side, there would be no rescue and no retreat. But Washington was not backing down. He had gathered a fleet of Durham boats, large, black, flat-bottomed cargo vessels normally used to haul heavy iron ore down the river. To pilot them, he relied on a very specific group, Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Mariners. These were tough, hardened fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts. If anyone could navigate a river choking with ice in a blizzard, it was them. But it was not just infantry that needed to cross. Washington's secret weapon for this trap was his artillery. He placed a young, booming-voiced bookseller named Henry Knox, in charge of getting 18 massive cannons across the freezing water. Moving 2,400 men in a blizzard is a logistical nightmare. Trying to load 2-ton iron cannons and panicked, kicking horses onto unsteady wooden boats in pitch darkness is borderline insanity. The original plan required the army to be completely across the river by midnight. That would give them enough time to march 9 miles and attack before dawn. But almost immediately, the timeline collapsed. The storm worsened. Midnight came and went. Washington watched from the riverbank as his window for a surprise attack began to evaporate. The crossing of the Delaware River was not a quick ferry ride. It was a brutal, 9-hour battle against nature. The river was swollen and angry. Massive, razor-sharp sheets of ice floated downstream, slamming into the wooden hulls of the Durham boats with deafening cracks. The Marblehead mariners had to use long poles to physically push the ice blocks away so the boats would not be crushed and sink into the freezing depths. Inside the boats, soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, shivering violently. Water crashed over the sides, soaking their thin, ragged uniforms. If a man fell into the river that night, he was dead. The water was so bitterly cold that hypothermia would kill him before he could even swim back to the boat. Moving the cannons and horses was even more terrifying. Frightened horses kicked and thrashed on the wooden decks, threatening to capsize the flatboats and send entire artillery crews into the black water. Henry Knox's loud, booming voice echoed over the roaring wind, directing the artillery pieces as they were carefully rolled onto the slippery New Jersey shore. Finally, at 3 a.m. on December 26th, the last soldier stepped off the boats. Washington's army was entirely across the river, but they had a massive problem. They were 3 full hours behind schedule. The whole point of this operation was to march the 9 miles to Trenton in the pitch dark and attack the Hessians while they were sleeping. Now, by the time they reached the town, the sun would be up. The Hessians would be awake. The element of surprise, the one advantage Washington absolutely relied on, was completely gone. Washington stood in the blinding snow, looking at his freezing, exhausted men. He had a choice. He could abort the mission, load everyone back into the boats, and admit defeat. Or he could risk total annihilation in the daylight. He looked at his officers and made the call. There was no going back. He ordered the men to fall into line. The trap was still on. Now, they just had to survive the march. The 9-mile march to Trenton was pure agony. It was not just a walk in the snow, it was a freezing death march. The blizzard was howling so fiercely that men could not see more than a few feet in front of them. The sleet froze to their hair and their clothes, turning them into walking icicles. But the most horrifying part was their feet. They were marching over frozen, jagged ground in nothing but thin rags. As they walked, the ice tore their feet apart. A trail of dark red blood stained the white snow for miles behind the American column. Officers riding on horseback could literally track the army's progress just by looking at the blood on the ground. The cold was so extreme that 2 American soldiers simply collapsed by the side of the road and froze to death. They died without ever seeing the enemy. Then, a new disaster struck. Word passed down the line to Washington. The freezing rain had soaked the men's gunpowder. Their muskets were useless. They could not fire a single bullet. Any normal general would have surrendered right there. But Washington's response was chilling. He looked at his officers and said, "Tell them to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton." To spring the trap, Washington had to divide his already tiny force. About 4 miles outside of Trenton, the road forked. Washington sent one column, led by General John Sullivan, down the river road to attack the bottom of the town. Washington himself led the second column, along with General Nathaniel Greene, down the upper road to hit the top of the town. The plan was to strike both ends of Trenton at the exact same time, sealing the Hessians inside. If the timing was off by even 5 minutes, the Hessians would easily crush them one by one. By 8 a.m., the sun was fully up. Washington's freezing, bleeding men finally reached the edge of Trenton. The trap was ready. At 8 a.m. on the morning of December 26th, the Hessian guards posted on the outskirts of Trenton were shivering in the blizzard. Through the heavy snow, they suddenly saw dark shapes moving toward them. Before they could even raise the alarm, Washington's men burst out of the whiteout, screaming and charging with fixed bayonets. The Hessian guards fired a few wild shots and ran for their lives back into the center of town. The trap had officially snapped shut. Washington's 2 columns hit Trenton at the exact same moment. General Sullivan sealed off the southern escape route, while Washington and Greene locked down the north. The Hessians were now completely surrounded. Inside Trenton, absolute chaos erupted. The loud crack of musket fire woke Colonel Johann Rall from his deep sleep. Still groggy from a night of drinking and playing cards, he stumbled out of his warm bed, threw on his uniform, and ran out into the freezing streets. What he saw was a nightmare. The Americans had not just brought infantry, they had brought artillery, and they had set it up perfectly. Henry Knox positioned his massive cannons at the very top of Trenton's 2 main streets. Because the streets were so narrow, they created a deadly funnel. Standing right next to Knox was a young, brilliant artillery captain named Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton and Knox unleashed hell. Cannonballs ripped down the streets, smashing into the panicked Hessian soldiers as they frantically tried to form their disciplined battle lines. The dreaded German mercenaries, the men who were supposed to be the most terrifying force in the world, were being slaughtered in their pajamas. Rall desperately shouted orders, trying to organize his men for a counterattack. He ordered his own artillery to fire back, but the American infantry moved too fast. Virginia troops charged forward, killing the German gunners and stealing the Hessian cannons before they could even be loaded. The mighty Hessians were pushed back into the town's center, trapped in a perfect kill zone. Colonel Johann Rall refused to give up. Even as cannon fire tore through his ranks, the proud Hessian commander tried to do what he had always done, charge with the bayonet. He rallied his best grenadiers and ordered a desperate counterattack up King Street. He wanted to break the American lines, recapture his cannons, and punch a hole through the trap. But Washington had anticipated this exact move. As the Hessians charged, American soldiers fired from the windows of houses, from behind fences, and from alleyways. The wet gunpowder issue had been solved for many Americans by finding dry shelter inside the town's buildings. Suddenly, 2 American musket balls slammed directly into Colonel Rall's side. He fell hard from his horse, bleeding heavily into the freezing snow. Without their fierce, veteran commander leading the way, the Hessian discipline completely shattered. The surviving German mercenaries retreated into an apple orchard at the edge of town, desperately looking for a way out. But they were totally boxed in. General Sullivan's men blocked the southern bridge, Washington's men held the high ground to the north, and the freezing Delaware River blocked their backs. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. Seeing that they were surrounded, outgunned, and leaderless, the remaining Hessian officers finally lowered their weapons. They raised a white flag into the snowy air. The battle was officially over. The entire engagement, from the first surprise shot to the final surrender, lasted just 90 minutes. The numbers from this battle are so lopsided they almost look fake. The Americans captured over 900 Hessian soldiers, along with all their cannons, thousands of muskets, and highly valuable supplies. Hessian casualties were around 22 killed and 83 wounded. And what about Washington's freezing, starving, shoeless army? They suffered exactly 0 combat deaths. None. Not a single American soldier was killed by enemy fire during the assault on Trenton. 2 brave men had frozen to death on the brutal march, but in the battle itself, Washington pulled off a flawless victory. The stunning victory at Trenton did not just win a battle, it saved an entire nation from being erased. When news of the unbelievable slaughter reached the American public, the psychological impact was absolutely massive. The dark myth of Hessian invincibility was destroyed forever. People realized that if a group of starving, freezing farmers could crush the most feared mercenaries in the world in just 90 minutes, then the mighty British Empire could actually be beaten. Remember those enlistment contracts that were about to expire in less than a week? After seeing what they had just accomplished, hundreds of Washington's exhausted soldiers changed their minds and decided to stay. The Continental Army did not evaporate into the winter snow. Washington's brutal winter trap proved that he was not just a retreating general. He took a broken army that was literally days away from extinction, marched them through a blizzard with bloody footprints, and delivered a knockout punch that flipped the entire Revolutionary War upside down. The British expected a clean, conventional war. George Washington gave them a phantom army who struck in the darkest, coldest moments, completely rewriting the rules of modern combat. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what historical battle we should cover next.